If Jesus walked into a modern bakery, he might not recognise most of what we call bread. A common Galilean loaf could be darker, rougher, and much harder to chew than the soft bread we buy today. We cannot know his exact daily recipe, but we can rebuild the kind of loaf his world knew. And one ingredient used in countless biblical bread recipes may be historically wrong. We will come back to that. First, forget the supermarket shelf. Forget the soft white slices, the plastic wrapper, the perfect square shape, and the loaf designed to stay tender for days. Picture Galilee in the 1st century. The morning light is already strong. Stone houses stand close together. Smoke drifts from a courtyard. Somewhere nearby, grain is being poured onto a grinding stone. You hear it before you see it. Stone against stone. Slow. Heavy. Again and again. That sound is breakfast beginning. Today, flour arrives in a bag. Back then, flour arrived through work. Someone had to grow or buy the grain, clean it, store it, protect it from moisture, insects and animals. Then grind it, sift it, grind the large pieces again. Only after that could the bread begin. Before the first drop of water touched the flour, someone had already paid for the loaf with time, shoulders, wrists and aching hands. Bread was not a casual side dish. It was the centre of ordinary food. It was the thing that made a meal feel complete. It could carry lentils, soak up oil, sit beside olives, cheese, figs or fish. It could fill the stomach when very little else was available. When people prayed for daily bread, they were not asking for decoration. They were asking for life to continue. That is the world we are trying to enter. Not through a palace, not through a battlefield, through a loaf. Before we touch the grain, it helps to understand how different the idea of bread was. For us, bread is a product category. There is sandwich bread, sourdough, rye, whole wheat, brioche, pita, flatbread, and dozens of other labels. For a Galilean household, bread was not first a category. It was a daily calculation. How much grain is left? How many people must eat? How much fuel can be spared? How much time is available before the rest of the work begins? A household could not separate the recipe from the economy of the day. If the grain jar was full, the dough could be more generous. If the harvest had been poor, the loaf might be smaller, rougher, or stretched with more barley. If guests arrived, the bread had to go further. If someone was sick, weak, or elderly, the softer centre may have been given to them. The loaf reflected the condition of the house before anyone took the first bite. That is why a historical bread recipe cannot be reduced to a list of ingredients. The ingredients are only the surface. Underneath them is a system of work. Fields had to be planted. Seeds had to be protected. Harvesting had to happen at the right time. Cut too early and the grain was not ready. Wait too long and birds, wind or weather could take part of the crop. Then came threshing, winnowing, transport, storage. Each stage carried the possibility of loss. By the time grain reached the kitchen, it had already survived a long chain of risk. That helps explain why bread could carry emotional weight. A loaf was ordinary, but it was never meaningless. Its presence on the table meant the chain had held. The field produced, the grain survived, the mill worked, the fire burned, the household endured one more day. The first question is simple. What grain belongs in it? On the table we have barley, whole wheat, emmer, einkorn and spelt. Every one of these grains sounds ancient. That is exactly where modern recipes get into trouble. The word ancient becomes decoration. A recipe adds spelt, black cumin, hyssop, honey olive oil, and several herbs. Then it is called the bread Jesus ate. It looks beautiful. It may taste excellent. But history asks a less convenient question. Was that ingredient actually common in Galilee during the 1st century? And if it existed in the region, was it common enough to appear in daily bread? Those questions change everything. Let us begin with barley. Barley was one of the major grains of the ancient region. It could tolerate conditions that made some forms of wheat struggle. It was used as food for animals and people. It was also often associated with humbler food. That does not mean every poor family ate only barley. It does not mean wealthy households never touched it. Real diets are rarely that neat. But barley carried a different status from fine wheat flour. Barley bread could be dense, dark, crumbly. It contains less gluten than bread wheat, so it does not create the same elastic dough. A high barley loaf may crack around the edges. It may rise only a little. It may feel heavy in the hand. A modern baker might call that a failure. A Galilean household might call it food. Then we have wheat. But which wheat? Emmer, known as Triticum dicoccum, had been cultivated for thousands of years. Einkorn, Triticum monococcum, belongs to an even older chapter of agriculture. Modern bread wheat also has ancient roots. And then there is spelt. Spelt appears constantly in modern biblical recipes because it sounds old, wholesome, and expensive. But old does not automatically mean correct. A grain may have existed for thousands of years and still be the wrong choice for one specific place and period. We cannot simply empty every famous ancient grain into one bowl and call the mixture historical. For this reconstruction, we will use a practical blend. Whole wheat as the main structure, barley for the rougher, humbler character, a smaller amount of emmer to explore the flavour of an older wheat. This is not a recovered 1st century formula. No tablet or manuscript gives us these exact proportions. It is our experimental choice, built from grains that fit the wider agricultural world of the region. That distinction matters. We are not proving that Jesus ate this exact loaf. We are trying to make something that would not look completely foreign on a Galilean table. The grain also carried social meaning before it became bread. Fine wheat flour required more work. It had to be ground carefully and sifted more thoroughly. That meant more time, more loss, and often more cost. A lighter loaf could signal access to better grain or better processing. A rough barley loaf could reflect a household working within tighter limits. This does not mean every loaf announced social rank like a uniform, but food quietly revealed circumstance, the colour of the crumb, the fineness of the flour, the amount of oil, the size of the loaf, the foods served beside it. A meal could tell you something about the household without anyone saying a word. That matters when we imagine the table around Jesus. The people listening to him did not all eat the same bread. Some knew hunger closely. Some handled grain as workers. Some bought food in markets. Some may have eaten finer wheat bread on special occasions. Others depended heavily on barley. When bread appears in a story, every listener brings a different memory to the word. One hears comfort, another hears labour, another hears shortage. Another remembers the smell of a fresh loaf after a difficult week. The same word reaches different lives. The flour should not be smooth. It should contain fine powder, bran, and small pieces of grain. Run it between your fingers. You can feel the difference immediately. Modern flour is quiet. This flour has texture. It scratches lightly against the skin. The barley smells dry and grassy. The wheat is warmer. The emmer adds a faint sweetness. Not sugar, grain sweetness. The smell of something that once grew in a field. Now imagine making this flour by hand. You kneel beside a stone. You place the grain on the lower surface, then you push or rotate the upper stone. The first pass does not create perfect flour. Some kernels break, some flatten, some escape. Some remain too large and must go through again. The shoulders begin to burn. Dust gathers around the fingers. The back stiffens, and the family still has not eaten. This part is easy to romanticize when we watch it for 30 seconds on a screen. The sound is beautiful. The stone looks ancient. The flour falls in a soft stream. But repeat the movement for an hour. Then imagine doing it tomorrow, and the day after that. Bread was simple in ingredients. It was not simple in labour. Each handful of flour carried the price of the field, the harvest, the storage jar, and the body that ground it. A modern cook brushes spilled flour into the bin. In a household living close to harvest, those crumbs meant something else. A weak crop could change the entire year. Rain arriving too late was not an inconvenience, it was fear. Stored grain spoiled by dampness or insects was not a small kitchen problem. It threatened the table. That is why every piece mattered. You scraped the bowl. You used the coarse fragments. You did not discard a loaf because the shape was ugly. The bread did not need to be beautiful. It needed to feed the house. There is another detail hidden in the flour. Ancient milling did not only change texture, it changed the entire experience of eating. Stone-ground flour could carry tiny mineral particles from the grinding surface. Over years, bread made from heavily milled grain could contribute to toothwear. Archaeologists sometimes see that wear in ancient teeth. The bread was not merely coarse in a poetic sense, it was physically demanding. It wore the body in more than one way. The people who made it felt the strain in their backs and hands. The people who ate it worked their jaws. The food left traces. This does not mean every bite was full of grit. It means the distance between grain and flour was less controlled than it is now. The grinding stone mattered. Its material mattered. Its surface mattered. The skill of the person using it mattered. A worn stone could produce a different flour from a newly prepared one. A careful household could sift. A poorer household might use more of what came off the stone. Again, there was no single Galilean loaf. There was a range. One family might produce a finer wheat bread on a special day. Another might rely on a darker, barley-heavy loaf through most of the week. A baker serving a town could work differently from a household preparing food for itself. The phrase daily bread covers all of that variety. It sounds simple because the words are simple. The reality was not. We place the coarse flour in a wide bowl. Now we need water. Romantic recipes love the idea of water from a sacred spring. It makes a perfect scene. A clay jug, clear water, sunlight. But a modern spring does not preserve first-century water. Its mineral content may have changed. The landscape has changed. The route to the settlement has changed. Clean drinking water is more honest than pretending we have recovered the exact water of an ancient kitchen. We warm it slightly, not because a Galilean baker used a thermometer, because warm water helps soften the old dough we will use as leaven. Could daily bread in Galilee be unleavened? Yes. Could it be fermented? Also yes. Both kinds existed in the ancient food world. Some doughs were prepared quickly, others were allowed to ferment. The method depended on the household, the occasion, the available time, and the type of bread being made. For this loaf we are choosing fermentation, but not with a packet of commercial yeast. We use a piece of old dough. A small portion saved from the previous batch could help leaven the next one. It looks unimpressive, greyish, slightly dry, a little sour. There is no neat glass jar, no rubber band marking the rise, no label announcing a 10-year-old starter, just dough that has continued to change. We place it in warm water. At first, it resists. Then the fingers break it apart. Clouds of flour move through the bowl. The smell rises slowly. Sharp, sour, a little fruity, alive. The old dough is not a magical object. Cultures fail. They dry out. They become contaminated. Families begin again. But the principle is powerful. A piece of fermented dough can carry yesterday's bread into the next meal. The leaven becomes a memory of the last batch. Now the flour goes in, not all at once. The wheat absorbs water differently from the barley. Some areas turn sticky, others remain dry. The dough tears when pulled. It does not form a perfect smooth sheet. That is fine. This loaf is not competing for a prize. It has another job. Hold together, bake through, feed people. We add salt, not too much. No sugar, no butter, no milk, no commercial yeast, and no generous pour of olive oil, simply because olive oil belongs to the region. Oil could appear at the table. It could enrich certain foods, but an ordinary household loaf did not need to become a luxury bread. Every extra ingredient makes the recipe more attractive to us. It can also make it less honest. The dough is mixed by hand. Press, fold, turn, press again. It sticks. The bran catches against the palm. The barley keeps the surface rough. You may be tempted to add more flour immediately. Wait. The grain needs time to drink the water. That is something bakers learned without measuring hydration percentages. They watched. They felt. They knew whether dough was too dry because it cracked under the palm. They knew it was too wet when it spread and refused to hold. They knew the flour because they had ground it. They knew the heat of the day, the fire, the bowl, their own hands. That was not primitive guessing. It was trained experience. We knead until the mess becomes unified. Not perfectly smooth. That may never happen with this flour. The goal is structure, not elegance. The dough should hold together when lifted. It should feel firm, but not dry. A few cracks are normal. The surface remains coarse. Then it rests, and the climate begins to work. Warm air speeds fermentation. A modern sourdough recipe may tell you to wait 12 or 24 hours. That does not mean a household in Galilee followed the same schedule. There was no refrigerator waiting to slow the process. Leave the dough too long and it may weaken or collapse. Use it too soon and it stays heavy. The baker watched the dough instead of the clock. The surface, the smell, the tension, the small increase in volume. Experience did the job of a timer. We allow several hours. Not because archaeology gave us an exact number, because this is a practical reconstruction, a bridge between what may have happened and what works in a kitchen now. The fermentation itself would have been shaped by the house. A cool winter room and a hot summer courtyard do not produce the same dough. The same amount of old dough could behave differently from one day to the next. If the culture was strong, the loaf might rise quickly. If it was weak, the dough might remain heavy. If the flour changed, the fermentation changed with it. Barley does not behave like wheat. Emmer does not behave exactly like modern bread flour. The baker had to adjust without naming the adjustment. No one said, "This batch needs 3% more hydration." They simply added water, or flour, or time. The recipe lived in the hands. That is one reason written recipes from the ancient world can feel frustratingly vague. They often assume knowledge. A phrase such as "make dough" can hide years of skill. How much water? How long to knead? How warm should it feel? How sour is too sour? The text may not tell us because the original cook did not need to be told. The kitchen itself was the instruction manual. The child watching the baker learned by seeing the dough change, by touching it, by smelling it, by failing, then trying again. Food knowledge moved through repetition long before it moved through printed measurements. This is also why our modern reconstruction can never be exact. We may know the grain, we may know the oven, we may understand the general process, but we do not possess the hands of the person who made the bread every week. We can copy the ingredients, we cannot copy a lifetime of touch. While the dough rests, we turn to herbs. This is where modern biblical bread recipes often become confident. Too confident. A beautiful jar of za'atar appears. Black seeds are sprinkled across the dough. Hyssop is added because the word appears in Scripture. The loaf immediately looks ancient. But the ingredient list may contain centuries of confusion. Let us start with za'atar. Today, the word can refer to a plant. It can also refer to a mixture of dried herbs, sesame, sumac and salt. The blend varies from region to region and household to household. It carries a long culinary history. That history did not freeze in the 1st century. Adding a modern za'atar blend to the dough and calling it the exact taste of Galilee would collapse many later traditions into one spoon. So we will not do that. Black cumin is just as slippery. The English name can refer to more than one plant. Nigella sativa is often sold as black seed or black cumin. Bunium persicum may also appear under the same common name. Cumin is different again. A recipe can choose the wrong seed before the package is even opened. Aromatic seeds were known in the ancient world. That does not prove one specific black seed was added to daily Galilean bread. We can test it in an experimental loaf. But we should not hide uncertainty behind a confident label. Then there is one herb that appears in countless biblical recipes. We will not name it yet. Its modern English name sounds certain. Its ancient identity is not. That is the ingredient promised at the beginning. We will return to it after the bread is baked. For now, we make 2 loaves. The first remains plain: whole wheat, barley, emmer, water, salt, old dough. The second receives a small amount of a regional aromatic herb, close in character to Syrian oregano. We are not claiming this exact herb appeared in Jesus' daily bread. This is an experiment. We want to understand what a small amount of local aroma does to a coarse loaf. The herb is crushed between the fingers. The smell rises immediately. Warm hillside, dry leaves, a sharp green note, something between oregano and wild mint. We use very little. Ancient people knew strong herbs. That does not mean every loaf tasted like a medicine cabinet. The dough rests again. Outside the kitchen, life continues. A boat moves on the Sea of Galilee. A net is repaired. Water is carried. Animals are fed. Someone checks the grain jar. A child runs through the courtyard. The bread matters. But the entire household does not freeze while it rises. That is a modern food video illusion. Perfect bowls wait in silence. No one interrupts. Nothing spills. Ancient cooking belonged to a crowded day. The dough waited while people worked. The baker returned when the feel and smell suggested it was ready. Our dough has changed. Not dramatically. This is not an airy white loaf. The barley keeps it heavy. Still, the surface is softer. The cracks are less sharp. There is a slight rise. The smell is more sour. The plain dough smells of grain and fermentation. The herb dough releases its aroma the moment we touch it. Now we shape. No perfect round loaf, no decorative scoring, no leaf pattern dusted with white flour. We divide the dough into smaller pieces. This helps it bake evenly. A thick loaf might burn outside while staying wet inside. A flatter piece is safer near strong heat. The rounds are pressed by hand, not thin like paper, not tall like modern sourdough, somewhere between a flatbread and a dense, small loaf. The edges crack. We wet our fingers and smooth them. A little flour stops the dough from sticking. Every piece looks different. That feels right. Now the oven. A first-century Galilean household did not have one universal oven design. Bread could be baked in different ways. On a hot surface, against the wall of a clay oven, near embers, on heated stone. The method depended on the home, the fuel, the available tools, and local practice. For this reconstruction, we use a clay oven with a strongly heated inner surface. At home, a preheated baking stone or steel can create a similar burst of heat. Not identical, similar enough to study the result. The fire begins badly. Smoke first, then flame. Dry twigs catch. The clay slowly absorbs heat. The air around the oven changes. Your eyes water. Smoke clings to the clothing. The skin on the face tightens. There is no digital display, no green light, no alarm. The baker watches the colour of the interior, feels the heat from a distance, judges how fast flour darkens on the surface. Experience does the work of a thermometer. This is the point where all the labour can still go wrong. The dough can stick. It can fall. The surface can be too hot. The centre can stay raw. A modern baker turns a dial. An ancient baker adjusted fuel, distance, timing, and instinct. The oven adds another layer of uncertainty. A clay oven is not simply a primitive version of an electric oven. It cooks differently. Heat comes from the walls, the floor, the air, and the remaining fire. The temperature is uneven. One side may be fierce, another may be gentler. A loaf placed a few inches higher can bake differently from one placed lower. The baker moves quickly because the heat escapes when the opening is exposed. This changes the shape of the bread. It changes the timing. It changes the crust. A dough designed for a controlled modern oven might fail in this environment. A flatter loaf makes sense because it cooks through before the outside burns. A smaller loaf makes sense because it can be handled quickly. A wet dough might cling to the surface. A dry dough may crack but remain manageable. The oven does not simply bake the bread. It influences the recipe before the dough is mixed. Fuel does the same. If wood is scarce, the household cannot keep a large oven hot for hours. The bread must fit the fuel. That may mean baking several pieces together. It may mean using residual heat. It may mean preparing bread at a time when the fire is already needed for other food. The ancient kitchen was efficient because waste was expensive. Heat could not be treated casually. A modern cook preheats an oven and forgets about the energy. A household gathering fuel by hand feels every flame differently. The first piece of dough goes toward the heat. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the surface tightens. Tiny bubbles appear. The edges begin to colour. The smell arrives before the bread is ready. Toasted barley, warm wheat, smoke, sour fermentation. The herb loaf smells brighter, sharper. The aroma moves beyond the oven. That smell may have been ordinary in a courtyard, not ceremonial, not special, daily. That is hard for us to imagine. Ancient food feels like an event because it is rare to us. For the household making it, this was another day. No one grinding grain thought they were creating history. They wanted enough flour, enough fuel, enough bread. The first loaf comes out. It is darker than most modern flatbread. The surface is uneven. Some areas are deeply browned. A few edges are nearly charred. Other parts remain pale. While hot, the loaf bends slightly. As it cools, it becomes firmer. We do not tear it open immediately. The inside continues to settle. Steam remains trapped in the crumb. The smell makes waiting difficult. While the bread cools, the room itself deserves attention. A first-century domestic space was not sealed away from weather, animals, dust, or people. The kitchen may have been part of a shared courtyard. Smoke could move through the same space where tools were stored and children played. The scent of bread mixed with oil, wool, earth, fish, animals and fire. That may sound less attractive than the clean image of a modern rustic kitchen, but it is closer to life. Food carried the environment with it. The loaf absorbed smoke, hands carried dust. The bowl was not a decorative object used only for filming. It belonged to the household. It may have held other foods. It may have been repaired. It may have been passed from one generation to another. Objects had longer lives because replacement was costly. A crack did not automatically mean the bowl was thrown away. A rough edge did not make the tool useless. The same practical attitude shaped the bread. A misshapen loaf was still a loaf. A dark edge was not a reason to discard the whole batch. The standards were different because the stakes were different. Our modern eye judges appearance. Their household judged whether the bread fed people. While the bread cools, we prepare the table. Not a plate labelled the exact meal of Jesus. That would repeat the same mistake. Instead, we choose foods that belong to the wider region and period. Olives, olive oil, lentils, a little goat or sheep cheese, dried figs, perhaps fish, especially in the communities around the lake. These foods fit the setting. They did not all appear at every meal. Season mattered, money mattered, location mattered. A fishing family near the lake did not eat exactly like farmers inland. A struggling household did not serve the same food as a wealthy family. History becomes false when every ancient table is covered with everything available in the region. Ordinary meals were shaped by limits. The bread sits in the centre. That position tells us something. Today, bread can feel optional, a basket brought before the real food. In much of the ancient Mediterranean world, bread was part of the foundation. It supplied energy. It helped carry other foods. A piece could scoop lentils, absorb oil, hold cheese, sit beside fish. The meal was not bread plus the important food. Bread helped turn the other foods into a meal. There was also no fixed border between fresh bread and old bread. A loaf did not become useless simply because it hardened. It could be dipped, softened in liquid, broken into a stew, eaten with oil, used to carry another food. The household adapted. That changes our idea of freshness. We expect bread to remain soft. Ancient bread did not need to behave that way. Its usefulness continued after the crust hardened. A dense loaf could travel. It could be carried into the fields, taken onto a boat, wrapped and eaten later. The texture that feels inconvenient to us may have made practical sense. Softness is not the only form of quality. Durability matters when food must move with the worker. A loaf that survives the day may be more valuable than one that collapses beautifully on the table. Now we break it. No knife, just hands. The crust resists, then it gives. A quiet crack. Steam rises from the centre. The crumb is dense. Small holes show that fermentation happened, but there is no open honeycomb structure. The barley will not allow it. The colour is brownish-grey. Bran remains visible. The bread does not look like a cloud. It looks built for work. The first smell is smoke, then sour grain, then something nutty. We taste the plain loaf first. The crust has a slight bitterness where the fire darkened it. The centre is moist but firm. You must chew. That sounds like a complaint, only because soft bread has trained us to expect almost no resistance. This loaf makes the mouth work. The flavour grows slowly. Wheat first, barley after. The emmer adds a mild, warm sweetness. A little oil changes it. The roughness softens. Salt on the surface sharpens the grain. With lentils, the bread suddenly makes sense. Alone, it can feel severe. With food, it becomes a tool, a complete part of the meal. Now the herb loaf. The aroma is stronger than the taste. The herb stays in the background. At first, it feels familiar. Then the barley returns. Smoke follows. The herb brightens the loaf, but it also makes it feel more like a seasoned modern flatbread. Which version feels closer to everyday reality? Probably the plain one. That may be disappointing. We wanted a hidden biblical flavour, a sacred herb, a secret ingredient. History often gives us something simpler. Daily bread did not need to contain every flavour of the landscape. Herbs could be eaten separately. Oil could carry aroma. Olives, lentils, cheese and fish can provide contrast. The loaf itself may have remained plain because the first duty of bread was not to impress, it was to feed. The modern desire for ancient superfoods says more about us than it does about Galilee. We want one loaf to contain everything: old grain, wild fermentation, healing herbs, sacred meaning, perfect digestion. A first-century household did not bake an advertisement, they baked food. That does not make the loaf spiritually empty, it makes it real. Imagine it placed at the centre of a shared meal. Someone gives thanks, hands move toward the bread, a piece is torn away, a child receives a softer section, a guest is offered food. The loaf becomes individual only when it is broken. That action is visible. Everyone sees how much remains. Everyone knows whether there is enough. Bread makes generosity visible. The phrase breaking bread carries spiritual meaning because the physical act came first. People shared one loaf. One meal, one table. The bread carried the labour of the household and the uncertainty of the harvest. When someone gave away part of a loaf, they gave away something measurable, something that could not be taken back. Now think about the sound of the meal. No plates being placed one by one. No electric refrigerator humming nearby. No plastic package opening. You hear hands against pottery, oil pouring, bread tearing, a spoon touching a shared bowl. Quiet conversation. Perhaps a child asking for another piece. Perhaps someone saying there must be enough left for morning. The meal is not silent, but it is intimate. Bread participates in that intimacy because it passes from hand to hand. The person who breaks it controls the first division. The person who offers it creates the first act of hospitality. The piece received is small, physical proof that you have been included. That is why bread carries meaning so easily. It is ordinary enough to appear every day. Yet dividing it reveals the relationships around the table. This makes the language of the Gospels feel different. Grain, seed, leaven, harvest, hunger, bread. These were not decorative images for people living close to agriculture. They knew what happened when rain failed. They knew the smell of fermenting dough. They knew the weight of a millstone. They knew the fear of looking into a storage jar and seeing too little grain. When a teacher spoke about bread, the listeners did not hear an abstract symbol floating above daily life. They saw food. There is also the question of taste. We often imagine ancient people as if they preferred blandness because they lacked modern ingredients. That is too simple. People everywhere seek pleasure in food. They notice aroma, texture, freshness, salt, smoke, sourness. The difference is not that ancient people did not care about taste. The difference is that taste operated inside stricter limits. A family used what was available. Fresh herbs came and went with the season. Oil quality varied. Salt could be precious. A bread baked with more wheat may have tasted different from one stretched with barley. A fresh loaf tasted different from yesterday's loaf softened in broth or oil. Even within poverty, People develop preferences. One child may have wanted the crisp edge, another may have preferred the centre, an adult may have liked a more sour batch. A household could recognise a difference between a good bake and a poor one. Ordinary food still had standards. They were simply grounded in experience rather than branding. Now we return to the ingredient promised at the beginning: hyssop. Modern biblical recipes often use Hyssopus officinalis. The recipe says hyssop. The cook buys the herb sold under that English name. The herb goes into the dough. The bread is presented as authentic. The chain feels logical. It may be wrong. The ancient Hebrew word, often translated as hyssop, is ezov. The word survived. The exact plant may not have. Hyssopus officinalis, the European herb commonly sold as hyssop, is not automatically the plant meant in ancient texts from the region. Several local aromatic plants have been proposed instead. Some suggestions point toward plants closer to Syrian oregano, marjoram, savoury, or related herbs. No surviving kitchen sample carries a label saying, "This is the ezoph used in Galilee." That missing label matters. Translation can create the illusion of certainty. An ancient word is matched with a modern word. The modern word points to a plant sold today. The plant enters a recipe. Soon the recipe is described as exact. Each step feels small. Together they can move us far from the evidence. So the most famous biblical herb in modern bread recipes may be the ingredient they get wrong. That is why we did not add common European hyssop. We used the small amount of a regional oregano-like herb only in the experimental loaf. Even then, we cannot claim that this exact plant was mixed into the daily bread Jesus may have eaten. The honest answer is less dramatic. We do not know. We can narrow the possibilities, study the language, compare regional plants, examine later traditions, but we cannot force certainty into a bowl because certainty makes a better title. The recipe also teaches us something about historical honesty. A reconstruction is strongest when it admits where certainty ends. That may feel like weakness in a video. It is not. The phrase, "we do not know," can open a better question. We do not know the exact ratio of barley to wheat, so we compare the behaviour of each grain. We do not know the precise oven used in every Galilean home, so we test more than one plausible method. We do not know which plants the word ezoph named, so we separate the translation from the modern herb sold under that name. Uncertainty does not stop the experiment, it shapes it. The goal is not to recreate one lost breakfast with impossible precision. The goal is to reduce fantasy until the remaining loaf fits the evidence. The same honesty applies to the bread itself. Did Jesus eat this exact mixture every day? No one can prove that. He lived in a world where bread was central. He likely knew breads made from the grains available in Galilee and Judea. Some could be wheat-based, some included barley, some were fermented, others were made quickly. The loaf changed with the household, the harvest, the season, and the money available. What have we made then? Not the personal recipe of Jesus. A loaf built from the food world he knew. Coarse whole grain, barley, wheat, a smaller amount of emmer, water, salt, a piece of fermented dough, hand mixing, warm air, strong heat. A bread that would not look completely strange on a table in first century Galilee. That may sound less exciting than a lost sacred recipe. It is more valuable. A fantasy gives us certainty. A careful reconstruction gives us contact with real life. We feel the stone, the coarse flour, the heat of the clay, the bread passing from one hand to another. The past stops looking like a painting. It becomes physical. The loaf is cooling now. The crust has hardened. Smoke remains in the surface. The herb bread smells brighter. The plain bread smells more severe. Neither resembles soft supermarket bread. Neither disappears in 3 bites. Both ask to be eaten with something: oil, lentils, cheese, olives, a shared dish. That may be the final lesson. Ancient bread does not fully reveal itself when eaten alone. It belongs to a table. A single isolated slice is a modern experience. This bread makes sense when it is broken and shared, so let us break it again. Listen. That quiet crack is the end of the recipe and the beginning of the meal. We did not recover a lost formula written in a Galilean kitchen. We followed the evidence until it stopped. Then we reconstructed carefully. We used grains that fit the agricultural world of the region. We did not assume spelt was automatically the answer. We used fermented old dough instead of commercial yeast. We baked with heat and smoke. We tested an aromatic herb without pretending we had solved the identity of biblical hyssop. And when the loaf opened, it gave us no miracle, only grain, fermentation, fire, and work. That is enough. The final loaf also reminds us that historical food was never only about ingredients. It was about timing. A loaf baked before sunrise belonged to one kind of day. A loaf made after work belonged to another. A household under pressure handled dough differently from a household preparing for guests. The same grain could become several kinds of bread, because need changed the method. That is why no single recipe can contain the whole story of Galilee. What we can recover is the pattern: coarse grain, careful use of fuel, fermentation when time allowed, simple shaping, strong heat, and bread meant to be shared before it became stale. That pattern is more believable than any claim of one perfect sacred formula. One more thing changes when you eat this bread slowly. You begin to notice how little of the modern food system is visible to us. We do not see the field. We do not see the mill. We do not see the fuel. We do not know the hands that shaped the dough. The finished loaf arrives separated from its story. This reconstruction puts the story back. The roughness is not a flaw. It is evidence of the grain. The smoke is not an artificial flavour. It is evidence of the fire. The dense crumb is not poor technique. It is evidence of barley, hand mixing, and limited fermentation. Once those details are visible, the loaf changes. It stops being a strange historical object. It becomes a record of work. That may be the closest we can come to the daily bread of Galilee, not by claiming certainty, by respecting every limit we cannot cross. Would you eat this bread every day, or would you miss the soft loaf from the supermarket by tomorrow morning? Write your answer in the comments and subscribe for more historically honest recipes from the ancient world.